Everybody, just picked up on this article from Nature, which was featured in the last American Vagabond, and I will leave a link to that video underneath this one. And I do very highly recommend the last American Vagabond, and advise everybody who's interested in understanding the facts around what's going on with the COVID narratives to check out last American Vagabond. And he does share some very important information and facts, and from a very balanced perspective, non-biased, and definitely not politically orientated, which is a very important factor. So he shared this article, but I think there's an interesting point to be made here because, as we know, our natural immune systems create antibodies when we are infected with a virus, and we do actually recover from that virus without any medical interventions. So had COVID, you'll probably make antibodies for a lifetime. People who recover from mild COVID-19 have bone marrow cells that can churn out antibodies for decades, although viral variants could dampen some of the protection they offer. Okay, so it's quite a long study that it's actually referring to here, and a very important study. And, well, it's something that's been known to medical science for a long time. Now, I've made this video now because I want to pick up on a very important point here. And I think medical professionals do need to be considering this now. And that is to do with this idea, with this viral variants could dampen some of the protection our natural antibodies offer. And this is now referring to the vaccines in terms of people who have had COVID-19 and recovered from COVID-19, and as to how the vaccine itself may impair somebody's natural immunity to COVID. And, this is a very serious issue because it could mean that people who have antibodies against COVID are actually going to be put more at risk when they're injected with this mRNA version, a genetically modified version of the virus, which is in itself a variant. You see, it can be described as a man-made variant of COVID-19 that is being used to protect people who are at risk because they have no antibodies to the wild virus, you see. But how might that impact on people who do have antibodies against the wild virus? And I think by now we can say with confidence that the vast majority of people, the greater majority of people who have not developed severe symptoms of COVID-19, or who have and actually recovered, or people who've been asymptomatic because they've contracted the virus but their body has successfully managed to fight it off without the body exhibiting any symptoms, then, it's fair to say that we have some sort of herd immunity, and that there are a lot of people who were never tested, who may have had COVID-19 and recovered from it, and who may now be placed at risk because their immune system has been impacted, is badly impacted, negatively impacted through the lab-created variant of COVID-19. And, this is a very serious issue. I mean, as a child, I had a very adverse reaction to the diphtheria vaccine. I developed a lump on my arm, and the whole of the top of my arm swelled up, and I had to go into the hospital. Well, my mum took me to the hospital because she was very worried, and it turned out that I had a natural immunity to diphtheria, and that was why my arm had swelled up, you see, because my body just immediately attacked that site. And in that case, with diphtheria, you're talking about a bacterial infection, which is a completely different thing. We don't tend to be able to build the same sort of immunity to severe bacterial infections in the same way that we do with viruses. Certain bacterial infections we can have our natural immune system responses, but some bacterial infections, like E. coli or something like this, are going to cause problems in the majority of people. If we eat, food infected with that bacteria, some people will fare better than others. But, we're talking about a virus here, and we know viruses mutate, and we know that there are variants. And according to the latest research about these variants, the Indian variant and the African variant and the Brazilian variant are very suspect, because it is, as far as I understand it, it's highly unusual for a virus to develop these variants so quickly. We're talking, like, according to them, to their estimations, less than 2 years that we've got all these different variants. And even if there are variants, the likelihood that these variants are going to be more deadly and more dangerous than the original virus are actually minimal, because a variant usually does involve it's a degeneration of the virus, you see, of the original pattern. And so often the variants are weaker than the original virus. I mean, not in every case. I mean, in some cases it can mean that a variant will bypass a vaccine, say, because it's a completely different thing. Whereas I think with these variants of COVID-19, I think the amount of attention that's been given to them in terms of, this means everybody's at even more risk, it just doesn't hold water, really, because the vaccines are, the main function of the vaccines available in Britain right now is this S-spike protein, and that targets the ACE2 receptor within cells. So it doesn't really matter which variant you get. All of these variants all utilize the same S-spike protein, you see. So it isn't, if say, for example, that this variant involved a completely different method of infecting cells and utilised a completely different antigen within the human cells in order to infect the system and replicate, then yes, that would mean the present vaccines would be useless against this particular illness, because this vaccine is designed to teach the body how to deal with this S-spike protein, you see. But today, all the knowledge that we have tells us that the S-spike protein is the prime mode of infection of COVID-19, SARS, I think MERS as well, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, and also COVID-19, you see. But my point here is that the vaccines themselves now are a different are a variant of the wild virus, in that they are injecting the body. You know, the body is injected with a genetically modified virus, mRNA, or modified viruses. You know, that is it, modified, in order to produce a response to this, a favourable response to this S-spike protein. And, you know, so I would say that there is a risk here, and I think it does need to be assessed. It needs to be assessed because things are moving very fast. And when you're talking about, you know, vaccinating children who we know are at the least risk of all social demographics, children are at the least risk. And as we have witnessed over the last 18 months. And we do know that there is a risk with all experimental products, all experimental medical products. There is a risk, and there have been thousands of, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of adverse reactions that have been reported on Britain's yellow card system. And so, therefore, it would appear, according to the statistics, and bearing in mind that a Harvard University study explains that only 1% of adverse vaccine reactions are ever reported. So, you know, when we look at Britain's yellow card system or the American VAERS system, we are very likely witnessing, let's be fair and say, well, actually, this is only 5% or 10% of the adverse reactions. You see, this is only 10% that has actually been reported. There could be, you know, out of 100, you know, we've got 10, but there could be another 90 that just weren't actually recorded. You know, people say somebody living by themselves, they've had the vaccine, a week later they've died of blood clots or whatever, but nobody ever connects it with the vaccine because there's no relatives around or there's no friends around to say, well, this person had the vaccine. So, you know, there are lots of scenarios in which people could suffer directly through an experimental health product and never actually be recorded. You know, the cause of that never actually being recorded. So I think it is quite fair to say that the vaccines, when it comes to children especially, the vaccines pose more of a risk against children than COVID-19. And since the vaccines do not claim to stop transmission or even stop people contracting the virus and transmitting it, then I fail to understand how it can be medically ethical to vaccinate children, to put them at a higher risk. And then we don't forget that these children, the majority of them, well, all of them have been, you know, locked in homes with people who've had COVID or are recovering from COVID, you know, because whole families were like on lockdown. Then it's fair to say that a lot of these children by now have a natural immune response. And therefore, these vaccines then could pose even more risk at undermining, weakening, even perhaps possibly destroying their natural immunity against COVID-19. You know, this is a very serious issue, and I shall make a very big fuss if YouTube takes this video down, because, you know, I am not speaking against the vaccines. I am not telling people, you know, don't have the vaccine or do have the vaccine. I have always promoted, I am pro-informed choice. People have a right to make a choice. They should not suffer because of their choice, you know, suffering criticism of people because they've chosen to have the vaccine or they've chosen not to have the vaccine. You know, people have a right to make an informed choice, and we are dealing with an experimental vaccine. And it hasn't been approved. It's been authorised for emergency use. And here in Britain, myself and many other people continue to question this need for an emergency, you know, this criteria that's been allowed for this vaccine, the label emergency, because the Imperial College decision as of 23rd of March 2020 saying that they no longer consider COVID-19 to be a high consequence infectious disease, and that stance has not changed. I will leave you the link to the government website and you can go and have a look. It's still there. It's still the same decision. That how then can we be described? How can COVID be described as an emergency if it's not a high consequence infectious disease? So if there is no actual emergency, then on what grounds have these experimental gene therapy trials been authorised? And then to the extent that they're now talking about removing parental consent, that, you know, in Canada they've set up vaccination centres for children, enticing them with ice cream, and have police officers, a large group of police officers standing between the public and the entrance. You know, like basically, if these children want to have this vaccine, they do not need parental consent. When it is a parent's duty, you see, it's a parent's duty as a parent to look out for their children and to be informed, because the state did not create and produce these children. The you know, children belong to their parents in that sense, are in the custody and care of their parents, who as adults have a duty to look out for their children and to weigh up all the evidence on any given medical health issue and decide, well, you know, shall I vaccinate my child against this, this or this? And, you know, to weigh up the pros and cons. And some people choose certain vaccines for their children and they decline other vaccines for their children. According to the levels of risk. And as people, we have a right to say, well, yes, I'll have this vaccine, but I choose not to have this vaccine because it is experimental and I'm not sure about it yet, and I don't want to subject myself to something I'm not sure about. Or actually, I do wish to have this vaccine, even though it's experimental, because, you know, I trust the government, I trust the medical professionals that are advocating this, I trust the BBC, and, you know, I personally am happy to take part in this for what I see as the greater good, you see, and to protect myself and other people. And according to the things I've read and learned, they tell me the vaccine is okay. You know, people have a right to look at the information that is available and to make their own decisions. But when it comes to medical professionals, they have a duty. They have an ethical and professional duty. All you medical professionals out there, you have a medical and ethical duty to look at all the information that's coming forward, all the studies. And if you are failing to do that, if you are failing to take into account all of the studies, then you have turned your back on your own medical ethics code. And, you know, that is no way to be practicing medicine, to be ignorant of studies and facts. And, sorry, here we have the Lancet article, again shared by American Vagabond. COVID vaccine efficacy and effectiveness, the elephant not in the room. So I'm not going to go through this article, but I will leave the link to it. And I will also leave another link beneath this video that refers to a joint East Anglia University, British East Anglia University study with Wuhan, China. And they studied 10 million people, which is far, far, far more people than were involved in the trials for any of the vaccines. Okay. And that study conclusively shows that asymptomatic people do not spread COVID-19. Now, I think that, you know, when you're looking at a study of that magnitude, then we have to take it seriously. We have to take it seriously because this idea that people can spread, asymptomatic people can spread the virus is what has, well, it's been the foundation of lockdowns and mask wearing and all of these other protocols, social distancing, constant hand washing, as all of that is based on the premise that asymptomatics can spread the virus. When in actual fact, it's been proven time and again that just is not the case. Okay? There is no evidence, there was no evidence ever that asymptomatic people spread flu or a cold. But we know that symptomatic people can spread those things. People who have a cold, sneezing, etc., have the symptoms of a cold or flu, that they're more likely to spread the virus. So in that case, you know, myself, if ever I get a cold, a really bad cold or flu, I actually stay indoors. I don't go out, especially in winter. You know, I tend to get a bad dose of flu maybe once every 4 years or something like that, or sometimes longer. But if ever I get that, I take care. I don't go outside. I don't socialise. You know, tell people to stay away because nobody wants flu. It is a really awful illness and it can lead to hospitalisation and death. You know, my sister died of flu at age 2. My auntie died of pneumonia after contracting flu. She was only in her 50s. You know, so I do know the seriousness of flu. But if I've got the flu virus but I'm asymptomatic, so I don't even know that I've got the flu because my body has just successfully fought it off, then there's no way that I'm going to spread flu to anybody. If there were any viral shedding, it's going to be a very, very much weakened version of the virus because my body's already attacked it and fought it off. So if anybody did actually pick up anything from me, then they are more likely themselves to fight it off asymptomatically and then have antibodies themselves without any of us even knowing of what has happened, because that's the way immunity works. And I think we do need to protect our immunity. I think vaccines are okay to protect the body from illnesses, bacteria and viruses that our body can't cope or deal with. But I think if there's a risk to our immunity, to our natural immunity, then we need to think twice about vaccines, about experimental vaccines. Because we're talking about a particular virus here called COVID-19 and a particular experimental gene therapy that's injected it into us to teach our immune system how to deal with this. But it's a genetically modified, it's a lab-created version. And the risk that then could be seen by the body as a variant, and that will actually destroy or attack our natural immunity to the wild virus. That's the point that I'm making here. And I do think that Britain's medical professions do need to pick up on this. You do need to pick up on the Wuhan East Anglia study, at what the Lancet is saying and what so many other medical professionals around the world are expressing concerns about the adverse events associated with these experimental vaccines. And the very idea that this can be rolled out on the public and even our children on the grounds of emergency authorisation, when it still stands to this very day, the London College decision that COVID-19 is not a high consequence infectious disease. And as I say, that they've never changed on that stance. And, I'll leave the link again under this video. How many times can we reiterate the points? The points that we can all look at the graphs and see that from the moment the lockdowns happened, the deaths just shot up. People being denied healthcare is just one cause of that. I mean, here we now have Dominic Cummings, playing his ongoing role, now acting as controlled opposition, claiming that, Boris Johnson killed thousands by not having the lockdown 2 weeks earlier, which is an absolutely false narrative, yet another distraction, when all the evidence tells us that, no, actually, Boris Johnson is responsible for thousands of deaths because he imposed lockdown after lockdown, and during each lockdown the deaths spiked in Britain, and that the deaths were being fraudulently reported, in the sense of people dying of anything within 28 days of, or was it 60 days at first, of testing positive for COVID. Oh, they died of COVID, regardless of the fact that, well, actually they died because they'd fallen off a ladder or because they had cancer. Even people not even testing positive but only suspected of having COVID, no matter what they died of, were being listed as a COVID death. So when you take out, subtract from the figures all the inflated, fraudulent claims about the COVID deaths, And you see that, well, actually, it was just the same average deaths that we usually get. But actually, there were a spike in even non-COVID deaths that was directly due to people being denied medical health care or domestic violence and other issues. People attempting suicide or people who did commit suicide, which suicide rates did shoot up. So, you know, there's some deeply, deeply serious issues, and I feel that it is down to Britain's medical professionals now to please stand by the facts and stop denigrating people like myself who, I sent information to my GP and to the local regional health authority, expressing my concerns and sharing the information. And I have a right to expect those people, the professional people, to stand up and ask questions on behalf of the health of the people of Britain. And especially when it comes to vaccinating children now with this particular experimental therapy. And I think at the very least, even if, you know, you want to say, well, all right, actually, we do think it's still an emergency. We think COVID is an emergency. There is absolutely no grounds whatsoever. It would not stand up in a court of law to say that when it comes to children, that COVID-19 constitutes an emergency health risk. There's absolutely no grounds of evidence for that whatsoever. So therefore, you know, children at least ought to be made exempt from that title, emergency, and therefore the authorisation cannot extend to children. So I'll leave the links. If YouTube takes this video down, then I shall consider, I will be taking legal advice, because, you know, this is about children. And I think that this will have to go to the human rights court. That we do need to consider a class action against entities like YouTube who are acting to censor our human rights. You know, like I say, I'm not sharing wild conspiracy theories here. I'm not trying to persuade people not to have a vaccine. I am righteously asking questions in defence of children and on behalf of children and on behalf of the human population, you know, the population of my country, the citizens of Britain. And I have a right, a freedom of speech and expression. And everybody does. We all do. And we all need to stand up for that right, to stand up for our human rights. Because, you know, no virus has a right to destroy and deny our rights. So, you know, thank you for taking the time to listen. Love and God bless to everybody. And we, you know, we all need to stand together, stand strong, and learn to live in love, with love.